happy soul of Donatello, and it's a pleasure to speak about someone who was as gifted and delightful. Donatello always merits the smile, lovable Donatello, and his contribution. We speak in terms of we're trying to develop a sense of this enormous current of inspiration that suddenly enthused northern Italy, and how just a handful of individuals, sometimes working together, oftentimes going within themselves, how they could take the complications that we know as life and the mess that we know as history and rapidly give it such an indelible stamp and shape and form. The problems then were the same problems that we have now. The lethargy of work, putting the effort in just to getting the daily living, and then trying to deal with all the memories and all the imaginings that we have in our physique, the same problems. And yet, unbelievably, we can sense increasingly with this lecture on Donatello and Nicholas of Cusa that a new vision had been achieved. And after the break, when we go down to the library and talk about Nicholas of Cusa, we'll be able to give it the name that the Italians gave it. And we need a little diagram. What was different for the Italian Renaissance was that the inner eye of vision became capable of seeing the unity in the pattern of form beyond the limitations of the complications of life. It's difficult to find ways of unifying in terms of matter, in terms of the complications of life. And it was at this time that it occurred poignantly to the mind of the early Renaissance that the problem was that we were looking in the wrong place. That these eyes give us the cues, but that the true integration comes from the inner intellectual vision. That form underneath matter is where the geometry of meaning becomes perceptible. And it becomes perceptible in an integrating sudden conception that the idea behind the shifting, changing flux of matter is eternally present, and something in man wakens and has a resonance with that. And through this inner eye of vision, he sees suddenly all, and comprehension comes. The conversion of matter to form, of marble to a sculpture, is exactly the transformation that was effected at this time. Yes, it had been done before. There were sculptors before. There were architects before, painters. But we have seen how, with the advent of Dante's monumental piercing to the structure of reality in its fulsome pattern, how in the inner eye of the eagle in paradise, man can see all. And we've seen how his contemporary Giotto began to crystallize pictorial space and finally architectural presence in accordance with that discovery. And we've had clues all along the way of how the sequencing of the frescoed panels of Giotto, the stories of Boccaccio, the poems of Petrarch, how this produced a sense that we are not presented with just a series of events in space, but that they articulate themselves through an inner time element. And this temporality is the very flow and essence of consciousness. And it is the consciousness brought to form that is the purpose of art. And this forming of consciousness through a time modality was the very essence of aesthetic experience for these individuals. And thus it was with great pleasure and comprehension at the same time that they began to raise architecture and painting, and now with Donatello, sculpture, to the state of art that we find it in our own time. We will see with Donatello that he leaves the art of sculpture in such an advanced state that for 500 years there was no appreciable advance over the effective technique and organizing of material, right up until our own time. We find that even someone as recent as Rodin still is very, very close to Donatello in terms of the development of conscious form. It was stated in the later Renaissance, in the high Renaissance, by Vasari and those individuals. Vasari was the architect of the Uffizi, and he, writing about 50 years or so after Donatello had passed on, made the remark that many in his time said of Donatello that he was a pre-incarnation of Michelangelo, and that in order to appreciate the great thrust of Donatello's work, one had to continue the motion of that comprehension with Michelangelo. And that if one took Donatello and Michelangelo together, one could see the epitome of the genius, as Vasari would say, of the Italian race in Florence at that time, for having not only recapturing the antique spirit, there's almost a sympathetic magic in that phrase, that somehow man had made a cycle of expressive creations, brought into manifestation elements that he could arrange in such a cycle, in such a series, that the antique spirit that had been floating for 1,500 years could come back into manifestation, come back and enthuse the forms. So that with Donatello, we find a very curious, to us, kind of mysticism. It's a mysticism that we are hardly acquainted with anymore, it having passed into popular parlance so long ago that we don't recognize it as a mysticism, but in fact it is. Donatello, when he was born, 1386, into an impoverished family. His father never amounted to much, was in debt frequently, but the young Donatello was apprenticed very early to the crew that were hewing the big white marble blocks from Carrara into the building materials for the Dumont, which was rising on the spot, had been rising ever since Giotto's Campanile had given the key and the tone to the whole structure. And in a way, the life of Donatello takes place against the background of the rising of the great cathedral. And as the great cathedral is built, Donatello achieves his mastery against the backdrop of this unfolding saga. And in a way, Donatello's life is like a slow motion play of what happened in the life of William Blake as a young man also. I don't know if you recall that Blake, from the age 16 to 21, was an apprentice engraver. And in order to gain mastery of his art, he was put in Westminster Abbey, and for 5 years engraved every single detail of Westminster Abbey, until the lattice work simply was a part of his visual, everyday perception and vocabulary. For Donatello, the great cathedral in Florence and its rising up into manifestation was just that. It was the lattice work of perceptual reality that over long decades, like some grand sonorous symphony, playing its themes to its completion. And it would be Donatello's best friend, Filippo Brunelleschi, who would dome this great cathedral, who would solve the unsolvable problem. And we will see with Nicholas of Cusa how he said that man's mind, trying to understand the world, was forever like trying to make a circle out of a square. That the two seemed to be so incommensurate. How could they be brought together? And yet for Donatello, as for Cusa, as for Brunelleschi, as for Dante, all of them at this time, there was a way, there was a knack, there was a mystical vision possible. But dedication was needed, something we have lost in our time. We have no longer any sense of the efficacy of dedication. We do not realize the reality of applied integrity, that the continuity of applied integrity is so rare in its powerful, sympathetic capacities that even the gods respect it, and even the gods will crown with wholeness the attempt on that basis. This is essential in the life of Donatello. He alone of the great artists of the Quattrocento was unmarried. He, in fact, when he began to earn his living, invited his aged mother to live with him. She lived until age 85. And Donatello took care of her all of his life. There have been studies on Donatello that emphasize that his great sculpture is all masculine, and that he doesn't attend to the feminine. But this is simply not true. Donatello attends to the feminine in the way that Dante in the Divine Comedy attended to the feminine. And we'll see in several of his major works his great capacity to envision through the inner eye the poignant humanity of the divine feminine, a paradoxical statement in terms of matter, a reconciliation of opposites in terms of form. And one of Donatello's greatest sculptures towards the end of his life was his portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a wizened, desert, demoniacal, religious genius whose great profundity lay in her unflinching dedication and integrity to the reality of divine incarnation among men. It is this figure that gives us the key, finally, to the significance of Donatello. I'm sorry I again have no slides. I will get slides made, but you can see from the photographs the incredible, haggard power of Donatello's vision of the feminine. Later on, when the refinement comes in the next generation, where individuals become used to the high-powered integration that Donatello and Brunelleschi would form, no longer hair raised by the electrifying sense of presence in it, when it became mythologically closed so that it was more comfortable as a civilized dynamo, we will find Botticelli bringing this feminine in a gorgeous vein back to us again. But it didn't come that way at first. In fact, it came through the raw, inner, visionary capacities of someone like Donatello and someone like Brunelleschi. All the time as he was a young boy, Donatello was surrounded by the hard rock that seemed to yield to the hand of man. The marble from Carrara, world famous even in our own day for its purity, for its exquisiteness. I have a slide somewhere of Henry Moore sitting on huge sawed blocks of marbles at Carrara, staring off into the vast spaces on towards Pisa and the sea, and one almost gets the sense of the sculptor whose hand moves like the informed blind man, not needing even to look at it to be able to begin to perceive and play with the forms. And later on, of course, when the pre-incarnation comes back again in full sun force is Michelangelo, he will seize the material as if it were some young being, and through the very force of his personality, blow into it through his intellectual vision, whatever shape and form he would wish to give it. But with Donatello, his great beginnings came from leaving the white marble of Carrara in Florence that was being hewn for this cathedral rising, coming into manifestation. He left Florence as a teenager for a short period, about 8 months, 9 months. And he went with Brunelleschi to Rome. And the two of them, often seen together there, often described in chronicles and annals as treasure seekers. These two teenage geniuses went to Rome, which at that time was evacuated. The papacy had moved to Avignon. The great papal establishments and palaces were largely under caretakers, and many of them quite empty. The antiquities of Rome had not been really unearthed. In fact, we think in our imagination of Piranesi's great engravings of the large antique monuments in full ruin and covered with vegetation, something like that. And in among these ruins of the antique world, the old Italy, Donatello and Brunelleschi, digging up and unearthing bits of marble, statuary, columns, began to see in a way the one towards architecture, the other towards sculpture, but in such a way that the two media played off one another. And one of the most outstanding characteristics of both artists is that they were entirely conscious of the complementation of the other art. Brunelleschi, in building always created an architectural space that welcomed a sculpture, and Donatello never made a sculpture that wasn't just right for the place it was made for. Unlike most sculptors, even today, whose works look somewhat interesting and decent in their studio, and when you take it out and put it on the site, it falls flat. But with Donatello, it looked so-so in the studio, and when you placed it on the site, it sparkled. Because it was the achievement of form, is the integration of idea and space, experience and conception together, that was brought to manifestation, so that a sculpture of Donatello's literally grasped the reality of the place and your perception of it, and throws it into blossom, grows it into a perception of apt form, understandable form. It has meaning, it has significance, and a great deal of that significance and meaning comes from your comprehension, your consciousness of knowing that you are seeing and what you are seeing. He returned from Rome with Brunellesco and his head full of ideas. There were great artistic competitions going on. Brunelleschi himself had lost a competition to Ghiberti to do some large famous doors. But when they came back, our Donatello was given a small assignment. He was to make two rather smallish statues, prophets, they called them, to go in a certain place on the cathedral. And these were his first public sculptures. Now, it's an odd realization when one sees these. They look like sleepy, young Italian teenagers, just woke up. Could they be prophets? How in the world? There's something characteristic, though, about this in Donatello. He was one graced by the gods, one blessed by Mother Nature, who allowed Donatello to be whispered secrets of life because he was someone who would never tell. His discretion as a human being made him a secret privilege to divine insight. And characteristically of Donatello, the prophets were young boys. They were not the haggard, godlike beings, but they were like those friends of yours in your adolescence, whom everyone knows are regulars on the planet. You could play with them. You could confide with them. The humanity of the divine becomes a particular privilege of Donatello to disclose. The idea, so powerful in its early 14th century mysticism, the idea that God might be a friend, might not be some tyrannical supercosmic force, but might be a friend, that mankind might be a gathering of friends of God, related by the fact that they all had a friend in common on this most esoteric of levels, on this most penetrating intellectual vision. These are the kinds of thoughts that one must keep alive and circulating in viewing Donatello. His cheerfulness, his humanity, has this overwhelming resonance of the spiritual mystery implicit in it everywhere. He was singled out as having done a fairly good job on these two sculptures, and since he was about 20, 21, 22 years of age, he was being given slowly more assignments, commissions. He was given a commission to do a David. And in 1410, Donatello produced a very interesting David. I guess I'll have to use this. His David in 1410 stands on the head of Goliath with his toga wrapped in such a way that it's almost a cape, tied nonchalantly around the throat, and he is standing with one hand on the hip in the blessing mudra. And 20 years later, he would do the same David in a totally different rendition. He would bring to this same figure the characteristics of the mature Donatello. He would do the famous nude David with the hat, sword in the feet, standing in his great triumphal posture as man having come into possession of some great natural integration. The face on the 1410 David gives us the view of someone who is just waking up to the world, is looking out with the pride of someone who is natural. But the David who is nude in 1430 looks with an eye of comprehension. He is no longer just seeing with the natural eyes, but he is seeing with the inner eye of coherent vision. And this is why he needs no further use of any conventional clothing, because he has eclipsed whatever limitations there might have been upon him in terms of ethnocentricity. The reason for this, very often, in anthropological perspective, the keys of meaning in an ethnocentric way gather around the great initiatory stages of the life process: birth, marriage, death. And at these transformative modes, they collect together, almost as if magnetized by the meaningful forms scintillatingly focused underneath them. And in Donatello's first David, there is a triumph in early life that's going to open up. In the second David, there is the triumph that has opened up not the possibilities of a man in the world so much as man seeing through the world to the forms directing destiny underneath. And this is the maturation of Donatello from the age of about 24, 25 to the Donatello who is in his 40s. All during this time, we find that Donatello increasingly is singled out by his lifelong patron, Cosimo de' Medici. Now, Cosimo, who we will talk about next week, is the most intriguing character in the whole story. He is, in fact, the key to the Italian Renaissance. It is Cosimo who, in his peculiar personality, brings the comprehension of a single mind into play across the entire spectrum of the life of the time. Cosimo, who was so close to Donatello, Vasari, and all the others relate that for 40 years, Donatello would do almost anything that Cosimo would have for him. There was one time that he refused. There was a commission. I have to tell an apocryphal story about Donatello every once in a while here. Cosimo had gotten him a commission, a wealthy man from Pisa, kind of a boor. And so Donatello had worked very hard on this torso, this bust, and had finally finished it. The man came to Florence. And when he heard Donatello's price, he just threw up his hands in a rage and offered him some pittance. So Donatello went to Cosimo And Cosimo had workmen take it up onto one of the upper balconies so that it could be seen in the proper light and space, knowing in his mind that the sculpture was beautiful, it was a masterpiece, it was well worth everything that Donatello asked, twice as much. Well, the man still refused. And so Donatello, hearing from the man that he probably could have and probably did do the sculpture in several days, grabbed an axe and pushed the sculpture over the edge and smashing it, and said, "Now, in 100th part of a minute, I have undone my day's work." And against the pleadings of Cosimo, would not redo the sculpture for the man. But other than that event, Cosimo became the great patron, as he would become the patron of half a dozen great artists at the time. When Cosimo was exiled from Florence in 1433, he left, and Michelozzo, the architect, went with him. Donatello left with Masaccio, Big Tom, and they went to Rome together. And Florence for a year was a very drab place. All of those who were making this life revolution happen withdrew themselves. And of course, the shame and the deadliness of the atmosphere began to occur increasingly as a burden in the Florentine citizens, as we will learn next week, throughout the Albizzi, who had exiled through political machinations the great Cosimo, and he came back to the city. And of course, the artists came back with him. Cosimo had fixed upon Donatello as his sculptor when he gave him the commission for the tomb of a pope. And this tomb has the figure of the dead man in full regalia up above on a bier, raised up by columns of marble. But what's interesting about this work is that down below are three statues of faith, hope, and charity. And when you look at faith, hope, and charity there, the statues are placed in such a way that the heads of the three women presenting these virtues are placed exactly in such a way that the arched skeleton comes almost like a halo down to the heads, so that the architectural space of the scalloped niche arch becomes the nimbus, the halo of the virtues personified in the sculpture. Donatello is presenting us with a conscious form of great significance and great power, that the place of a sculpture like this in an architecture as was coming into being was capable of producing an experiential journey, a sequence, a temporal sequence for human beings that would enable them to mature their sense of inner vision to the point of manifest form. In other words, Donatello, like all the other thinkers and writers and artists that we have seen thus far, was creating a medium whereby the populace of the city of Florence and of these other cities that participated in this revolution in consciousness, whereby the everyday life of the citizen was transformed from a habitual mode to one of aesthetic intuition. It became a part of the general milieu, the ambiance of the city itself. And we find increasingly individuals like Brunelleschi and Donatello reading Dante as the workbook, as the basic work, as we saw in the Gandhi series, how we use the Bhagavad Gita, they use the Divine Comedy. It became for them the template for their experience as artists, as men, as visionaries. And in the Divine Comedy, as we saw, the progression moves from the Inferno and its static hierarchies through to a transformational mountain and its spiralings to an experience of a cosmic whole in paradise, which is experienced as a mystery, not portioned out bit by bit, but delivered integral, instantly, full-blown, so that what man experiences in terms of a time delay realization is the significance of what was presented to him whole. And thus it was that life became sanctified by art in the Renaissance, because it took the space of a human life to be able to recognize and sift and experience fully the meaning of the civilization that had been produced, the meaning of the architecture, the sculpture, the paintings, the literature that had been produced for them. And as that meaning and significance sank in and matured for 3 or 4 generations in a row, there was an increasing consciousness as to the exponential possibilities of applying this, so that by the time we get to Donatello, it had become self-conscious. Donatello and Brunellesco, Cosimo, it had become self-conscious. And we will see that the one lack that was increasingly felt was that there was no philosophy at this level, that the philosophy of the early Renaissance was the weakest point in the whole link. And it will be Cosimo, as we will see next week, who will purposely set about, just as the United States did in the 1960s with their Put a Man on the Moon program, purposely set out to find someone and train them to become the great philosopher of this civilization. And they would find that person, and they would build a school for him, they would train him, and he would in fact grow up and be that person. And the philosophy that was coming into manifestation was largely a Platonic Hermetic revival, given the peculiar ethnocentricities of the northern Italians of the Quattrocento. In the process of doing this, they would produce what we recognize today as the Renaissance. Donatello, in his sculpture, in his work, would begin to manifest the divine in forms that at first are disconcerting. The most popular image of a Donatello frieze immediately that comes to mind, and there are so many of these that we can pick among a dozen or 24 examples, are what the Italians call putti. Putti are the small little angels, the little winged angels that later on become the Cupids, and later on become, in Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream, the nice little fairyland creatures who will help man if he keeps his integrity together. The putti, the little winged angels, are a presentation of the levels of divine reality, the angelic orders of Dionysius the Areopagite, in terms of endearing human images, in terms anthropologically of man's rebirth in terms of what Renaissance means. A rebirth of the classic spirit, a reincarnation of that classic spirit. And how does it come back? It comes back at the beginning of its cycle of wholeness in the children, and the images of the children in the mind of Donatello as these putti, as the small angels. In fact, when Donatello will make the naked David with all of his assertiveness, he at the same time makes a very interesting sculpture to go with it called Cupid. And just as we have the David, which I will get slides for all these eventually and put them up, we have the Cupid at the very same time. And these two sculptures go together. They belong together. And so it is in Donatello that we find, perhaps for the first time, in his Madonnas, the image of the child Jesus as a baby who does not present some immediate gaze out powerfully to the world, but as a child who turns to its mother for substance. And we find in Donatello Madonnas who are mothering the infant, or holding the head tenderly, who are loving this baby, so that the divine archetype is no longer presented in an electrocuting, powerful presentation, but has begun to be mellowed and brought into manifestation to the human family, so that the humanists of Donatello's time, Brunelleschi's time, were those who were bringing into manifestation the divine, the celestial hierarchies, but they were putting them into a human time motion, a lifetime. They were putting them into a life cycle so that there were angels that were children. In fact, it's interesting to see and review one of Donatello's great friezes, where he shows John the Baptist, St. John the Baptist, as a child. And St. John the Baptist as a child still has the rough hair shirt of the desert ascetic. He still has the nimbus and still carrying the crossed staff, forerunner of the crozier. But he is a child. He is a beautiful child, like one might be seeing playing in the streets. And it would have been a very easy transposition to the perceiving eye of the Florentines at this time, the northern Italians, to see such a boy as this playing in the street with other boys like that, and the inner eye seeing that could be John the Baptist. That baby could be the Christ child. That there was not this confusion so much as there was this transposition, that every human being had this possibility, so that the phrase that Pico della Mirandola would use later on was that man had a dignity that was cosmic, because alone this inner dignity and sense of presence allowed him to be mobile throughout the entire universe in every level of manifestation and meaning. That if there was a glue holding the universe together, it was man's dignity which allowed him the mobility of transformation and motion. And thus it was that the curse of change in the world was transformed into a virtue of inner mutability that allowed for the transformations. And in this transformation, increasingly, man would experience the blessings, the grace of divine love, recognizing that this is the only medium that holds throughout all the stages of life, throughout all the perceptions. It was Donatello who, for the first time, presented us with sculptures of living Florentine personages of great power and dignity, presenting them as royal individuals. We had not seen such portraits since the days of classical Rome. Donatello, having this capacity, was then chosen. He was about in his mid-40s, chosen by the city of Padua to come to Padua and to make a monument to one of the famous soldiers of fortune of the day, a man named Gatta Mila. And the Italian word, the conditoroti. This man who had done so much for the city of Padua was to be given a public statue, and they wanted a statue on a horse. So Donatello worked on this public sculpture, and it still stands there. And we have, for the first time since classical antiquity, the presentation of a royal, dignified, powerful man upon his horse in the middle of a prance, one hoof on the ball to show the mobility and the grace. This statue caused a great uprising of cheer among the people of Padua. It seemed to them that Donatello was, in fact, one of the ancient sculptures come back into manifestation, and they besieged him to stay in Padua and work on the Cathedral of San Antonio there. Well, Donatello, happy soul that he was, stayed for 10 years in Padua, making a whole series of friezes and sculptures and so forth, but characteristically finally said that he could take no more adulation. He said he was getting rusty, and he had to go back home to Florence where there were nothing but critics. That he, in fact, returned to Florence and was given a number of great commissions there in Florence. It was at this time that Cosimo arranged for Donatello to produce a series of sculptures, among which is the Mary Magdalene. The dome of Brunelleschi was coming into manifestation. And in 1455, as the cathedral came into being, as that architectural mandala achieved its conscious form, with all of the implications that we talked about in the lecture on Brunelleschi, Donatello produced a series of sculptures that were to influence sculpture right up until the 20th century. Among them was a St. John the Baptist, this time not as a child, but almost as a Baroque, haggard, holy man, almost too wild and powerful for civilized life. And it was at the same time in this series that the great Mary Magdalene was produced. And as if the Baroque St. John the Baptist were not enough, he produced, towards the end of this cycle, a John the Baptist who is as close to a Zen master as any Western sculptor has ever come. And these, you can see them closer up. I'm sorry I haven't slides yet. We'll have them. You can see in these works, even in the photographs of these works, the coming together of the sense of crystalline form that Giotto had developed and the great architectural unity of space commanded that Brunelleschi had developed, and the poignancy of Donatello of taking the human life from its innocent childhood through various growths to old age, when the dignity of man shagged and hoary with experience, still held that inner vision that was vouchsafed to the Putti before. That is to say, they were participants in a divine order that so transcended this world that on full realization of it, one could happily leave this world and exit to the other. Joseph Campbell, in his first Esalen lecture, said that one of the uses of mythology is to get us to agree to leave elegantly without digging our heels in. That we have run our course of life, let's not complain, let's not seek to stay here, that let us go and enjoy this transformation. And thus, in the Renaissance, in the 1450s, early 1460s, the whole notion of death received a transformative envisioning and became, in fact, not just the final culmination of a series of steps leading toward it inevitably, but became the summation and experience of a transformation that had always been implicitly there from before birth, and that in fact then the life of Christ was a pre-incarnation of every man. That the eternal was always where it was, always in the pure form of the good, and that the permutations here had never affected it in any way whatsoever. Therefore, one could joyously be here and joyously leave for there. That this freedom from the anxiety of this ultimate split, this polarity of life-death, freed Florence at this time for the next incarnation. And that would be the rising of a world-class philosophy about the possibilities of the divinity in man. And in 2 weeks, we'll see with Ficino how this finally came into being. And we have lived on the glory of that for the last 500 years. We are still within a society recognizable as having descended from the Renaissance and that idea. Now, I have a number of things to say about Donatello, but I'll include them when we talk about Nicholas of Cusa after the break, and we're going to go down to the library, and I'll present some more, plus some of the ideas of Nicholas of Cusa, which are implicit in what I've said about Donatello. So let's take a little break. I'll be hawking my wares on the sidewalk, and I'll be back up. The best book on Donatello, this is the paperback version of it, The Sculpture of Donatello by the great art historian Jansen. This originally was a large 2-volume work with about 600 plates. And this book is about the only one really that you would need. On Nicholas of Cusa, the only really insightful work is this one by Ernst Jussieu, The Individual and the Cosmos in Renaissance Philosophy. Jussieu was associated with the Warburg Institute, and towards the end of his life, in the Second World War period, with Yale. Nicholas of Cusa lived from 1401 to 1464. So he died in the same year that Cosimo de' Medici died, and Donatello died 2 years later in 1466. So the mid-1460s, somewhat of a watershed here. We'll see that Ficino, by the by 1464, had already translated a great deal of Plato and all of the corpus hermeticum, that is, all of the classical hermetic material had been translated in most of Plato. It's difficult for us to think that during the period called the Middle Ages, or when I was a child it was called the Dark Ages, the understanding of antiquity was completely scrambled up. It was an odd amalgam. Many errors had been made for centuries on end and compounded, and the only adjective that you can describe the intellectual atmosphere with is murky. There was no real understanding of what the ancient world had been, of any of its reality. And so, in a way, the image of the young Donatello and the young Brunelleschi as teenagers digging in the ruins of Rome to try and get some real facts in terms of a piece of marble is very poignant. They were literally pioneers trying to uncover facts. What had happened? It was a great mystery. It had been a mystery for almost 1,200 years by that time. If man had been so great, if the civilization had been so monumental, what had happened? It was like the proverbial aftermath of some Holocaust. And, of course, with a nascent civilization coming up, with the realization these individuals were not children, they were not primitives. They knew that they were bringing back into being a very high order of human being. And they wanted to know what had happened. Were they susceptible, perhaps, to what had assailed the antique world? Their only real contact was through the Byzantine scholars. Themistocles Platon was the most famous, in Caesarea. Nicholas of Cusa, who actually learned Greek, which is a very hard thing to do. It takes 20 years or 25 years to learn Greek. It's not like learning French or Italian or passing a language exam. Reading philosophic, cultured, Hellenistic Greek is almost impossible. You almost have to grow up with it in order to understand it. But the contact at this time was with the late into the line Byzantine scholars, and the Byzantine Empire was falling too. It was crumbling. It was a very germane question. What is it in civilization that is so lethal? And are we just building another sandcastle? Is all this going to come down? So these were real questions. And for the only real early philosopher, Nicholas of Cusa, it seemed to him incumbent upon him that he understand the history of thought and that he make some attempt, at least, at a systematic unity of human thought. And so Nicholas of Cusa is the first philosopher in this whole period that attempts a systematic presentation of human thought. His first famous work, De Docta Ignorantia, presents the doctrine of ignorance. That is to say, it's not simply that we don't know about ultimate conditions. It's that we cannot know about ultimate conditions. That there is a complete separation that he could see in reading Plato, the great arguments in the Republic, the wonderful myths in the Phaedo, the stories that are told in the Phaedrus, but in particularly, Nicholas of Cusa was the first European to actually read the Parmenides of Plato and came face to face with the old Parmenidean polarity. What is, and what isn't. And that there's no commensurability between them whatsoever. That there are polarities that are mutually exclusive infinitely. That the ideational world, the ideal forms, have no contact in a commensurate way, in a staged, progressive way, with this world. That the way in which there is an interchange is a mystery to men, and is always going to be a mystery. The medieval world had based itself, naively, on the confidence that there were gradual stages connecting man and heaven. There were orders, and if one just followed these emanation orders, one could literally climb the stairs. That there were golden stairs. Maybe you didn't do it, and maybe no one you knew, but if someone could, they were there. But with the Quattrocento, with Donatello, Nicholas of Cusa, Brunelleschi, it became apparent that in classical antiquity it had been understood that there was a break, an incommensurate gulf between heaven and earth. And that in many ways they were polarized. That what was so here was almost automatically not so there. The changing of this world was in fact permanent there. So that when man tried to use colloquial paradigms from his experience here, untutored, he always fell into a trap of what Nicholas of Cusa would single out as the flawed Aristotelian logic of the syllogism with its missing middle. And that in fact, one could never approach in this way any understanding of the divine, so that one had to retract and go back. And this was the curiosity kicker in the works. They had to go back and re-understand and relearn what the ancients had established for themselves, in particular Plato, in particular the conundrum presented in the Parmenides. This meant that all the static cosmologies that had been lent on, dependent upon, had to be scrapped. Now this didn't occur all at once. It didn't penetrate what this was going to mean all at once. It was such a monumental realization that it took a couple of generations for it to sink in. And when it began to sink in toward the end of Michelangelo's life, even such a mighty synthetic genius as he was beginning to be very disturbed. There were, as Sir Kenneth Clark once observed in his book Civilization, there were clear storm warnings on the horizon of civilization. That if all this were so, if man was really what they had discovered him to be, And life was a very peculiar circumstance in that we had better change our whole way of living to adapt ourselves to the real efficacy of the process and to stop daydreaming. But the first warning signal in all this is Nicholas of Cusa. He studied at Padua University, and he was there in the late 1420s. He was influenced a lot by Meister Eckhart in his mysticism. I won't go into that. We've given a lecture on that. And Dionysius the Areopagite. We've also given a lecture on that. Several, in fact, on that. But it wasn't his education that affected him. It was a sudden realization. He had gone on a visit to Constantinople. He'd gone to see the Byzantine scholar Platon. And when he was crossing the strait, it suddenly occurred to him that this problem of the incommensurate was never going to be solved by intellectual finagling on a natural basis. And what was brought into realization for him, snapped into fact for him, was that the inner I had to reject a graduated cosmos and had to prepare itself to accept a full-blown integrated realization. And that what was graduated was not the approach to the realization, but the explication of the realization in terms of man's life, in terms of the conscious time which it took for him to articulate to him. And so this cone of purgatory leading up to paradise was turned upside down. And a man had to prepare himself to be conscientious, because only through a long life of conscientiousness could he absorb and explicate for himself in living reality what the significance might be of such a penetration of the divine. This would change the entire nature of consciousness. It would no longer be a question of having a super tinker toy set and building some kind of construct. It meant that you had to live a life of integrity and continuity to allow for the unity to play itself out, so that one could finally, in one's life, see the wholeness of the pattern. The difficulty is that life is very difficult to have continuity. We may have money, we may have power, we may have adventure, but the most difficult of all is to have continuity, because everything impinges upon it. Everything takes us away from it. Job, ambition, dreams, work, play, everything bleeds us away from that inner presence. And so we need help. We need help organizing the exterior world into nodes of integrity so that we can readjust ourselves along the way. And this is what architecture, and sculpture, and painting can do for us. Even music. Even philosophy. And so the utility of these great constructs in the Renaissance became the working material for wholeness. They were not making treasures for museums. They were trying to get beacons to help themselves to maintain the continuity of their sense of inner presence, because it was the only real bona fide salvation left to them. This produced a change which from the exterior is viewed always as the pagan revival. It's not so at all. they just became really religious and realized that the lax clergy, the power-finagling priests, were not going to be able to help them. Not because they were lax, not because they were power machinations, human beings did that, but because there was no longer an efficacious way in that mode. They had to go to the man. Man had to be all things, and the dictum that he could be all things, that the circle of meaning was just the circumference of his total reach and step, became the paradigm for his realization of interior integrity as the only way, the only possibility left alive to the alert. Now, there were many people, as we have in our culture today, who just have no idea, could care less. But if you did begin to care, if you did begin to know, by the 1460s, you would come into possession of some glimpse of this. It might be in a disconcerting way. So that architecture and sculpture and painting are beacon lights of integrity. And when had they been whole best? In Greece and Rome. And so the recovery of classical antiquity was an exercise in literally unearthing clues for their wholeness. They weren't treasure seekers. They were pioneers of a new mentality. And this has the most peculiar tone to it. And Cusa in here, I think, if I can give you this. Nicholas of Cusa, the starting point is the opposition between the being of the absolute and the being of the empirical condition. In other words, the being of the infinite and the being of the finite. But now the opposition is no longer merely dogmatically positive. Rather, it must be understood in its ultimate depth and conceived of through the conditions of human knowledge. This position towards the problem of knowledge makes Cusanus the first modern thinker. It was the realization that our mind can only work through a certain knowledge image base, and that if that knowledge image base is highly problematical, if it requires a radical transformation and reorganization, where is man going to stand in order to make that? He's going to have to stand outside of himself. Ecstasis. He's going to have to stand outside somehow. But he can't depend upon his feelings, his emotions. What does he have left? For Nicholas of Cusa, the only thing he had left was the mathematical clarity of the pure intellect. So geometrizing became an exercise in salvation. The development of perspective, arranging this world so that it coalesced to the vanishing point beyond, became not an artistic exercise so much to train perspective as the codification of a methodology by which our knowledge on this physical basis can be organized and unified to a threshold which vanishes here but opens up beyond. So that the inner eye of man, in the late Renaissance, Shakespeare's time, Cervantes' time. And we'll get to that, because that's a peculiar problem in itself. When they wanted to express it, they called it the occult eye. Robert Flood had this great diagram of man's cranium, all nicely organized and lettered in the different areas, and what came out was the occult eye, the inner eye, see. But when that first came as a glimpse, as an idea of wholeness, in Nicholas of Cusa in 1440, it wasn't formulated yet. It wasn't understood yet. It had to be played with and felt for. There is a career of ideas. It takes about 150 years for an idea to occur in the mind of some pioneer, and for that idea to mature and finally find its way down to general use in the populace. It takes about 150 years for that. These synthesizing ideas are very powerful. Man is ignorant. He is ignorant not because he doesn't know, but he's ignorant, as Socrates said, because he thinks he knows and he really does not. So that the beginnings of wisdom come in recognizing the limitations of what one knows. And how can we do that best? By putting them into a form. Because when we can show ourselves the forms, that's it. And what we don't know is where they belong. We don't know the context. We don't know the ultimate extension. And so what becomes perceptible with conscious form is infinite space. And a work of sculpture, as anyone can experience for themselves, is not contained by the form, but also has its position in that it makes alive the space around it. One even talks aesthetically sometimes as a work of sculpture controlling space. So that what is, but in this reflexive way also illuminates for us in a very special way to the occult eye what is not. And the invisible realms of ideational form come into apperception. They become not available as keys which could be pocketed, but as modes of possibility which can be worked with in the sense of context. Whenever this occurs in civilization, it's occurred many times, dozens of times. And what happens is that man becomes a mariner on the seas of possibility. He begins to explore. He wants to explore that world. And so he takes the ultimate form, himself, and puts it in motion against the world of possibilities. And in that adventure, discovers the chain of sequences, the golden chain sequences that will finally be understood later on as the mythology of that epoch. And so with Donatello, we find the form of man coming into an interesting juxtaposition with the form of the divine. And if you'd like one image for that, think of the putti. Think of child angels, happy child angels with wings and instruments. And in the high Renaissance, when the mythology of the epoch was becoming conscious, these putti are everywhere. They're in all the paintings. And when Titian and Tintoretto began building up the apex of the visual spaces, there are whirlwinds of putti everywhere rising to the vanishing point. But they first came in through the hand of one man, Donatello. And they came into comprehension through one other man, Nicholas of Cusa. He goes on, and Cusa goes on, and he gives us here the true organ of its apprehension is the intellectual vision, the visio intellectualis, wherein all the opposition of logical geniuses and species are resolved. For in this vision we see ourselves taken beyond all empirical differences of being and beyond all merely conceptual distinctions to the simple origin, in other words, to the point that lies beyond all divisions and antitheses. For that point to be approachable, as Cusa will point out and Nicholas of Cusa explicated so well, there needs to be a conjunction of opposites. One has to take the absolute greatest and the absolute least and bring them together. Well, the absolute least is a little baby, a human baby, and the absolute greatest are the angels of ultimate vision. And so those putti of Donatello are that reconciliation of opposites brought together. And the mystery that they present is one that is the vanishing point, the threshold of universal rebirth. When this was first understood as an epical event in Basel, Switzerland in the 19th century by Jacob Burckhardt, he used the only word that he could to describe it. He said this was an age of rebirth, the Renaissance. And he coined the word, coined the phrase. And he understood it because at his city, at his time, it was also undergoing the beginning of this vicissitude in civilization. In our time, we don't have the artists so much as we have the scientists, psychologists. If we look for a Michelangelo in our age, we don't look for someone who made buildings. We look for someone who understood the inner secrets of the self, the transformation. Maybe somebody like Carl Jung's the Michelangelo of our time. Well, there's always a mastermind in the works. And next week, you'll see Cosimo de' Medici, who really, the phrase that the Italians used of him was pater patria, father of the country, the father of the whole world. And he is sort of a godfather for the entire Renaissance. He was the man to whom they all came, and he always found a way to handle the situation. Once when Donatello was angry because one of his young assistants had left for another sculpture, he was enraged and in a fit of madness went off to this other city to kill this young lad. So Cosmo sent a messenger on ahead, and the messenger told the youngster not to run or complain, but to laugh, because Cosmo understood things. And so when Donatello came back, Cosmo asked him if he killed him, and he said, no. He said, the guy laughed, and I started laughing, and pretty soon we were drinking. So Cosmo was that sort of a fellow. He knew what to do. Well, we'll see him next week.